So we've got a problem, several to be exact. I put this 110 motor on my daily driver a while back, assuming its stock performance couldn't be any worse than a standard China doll. I was very wrong about that, and this thing has less power than the 49cc two-stroke, which was pretty underwhelming.
Yeah, she's still pretty crappy.
And that's bad because this is our daily driver with the rack and bags, which means if it's not working, we can't go do fun stuff, like take some of our crappy reloads to the gun range for some bang bang. Well, in this video, we're going to take this motor from riding like this and unlock its true clutch slipping potential.
Hello!
This is part 1 in a 2-part series. In this video, we'll recap the many issues this motor has, go over how we solved them, and show you how we went from something that's impractical to use to very satisfying. In part 2, I'll go over the fine-tuning to see how much potential we can get out of this motor. So let's get straight into it. This motor's got some big problems. That's not Mr. Piston. Mr. Piston has googly eyes. Keep looking. Okay, so let me put this in perspective. The 110cc motor, it's really 85 cc's. It's got a 40mm stroke with a 52mm piston. However, it has less performance than our 49cc motor. Let that sink in. Link in the description if you want to check out how bad this motor truly was in our initial test. The first issue we're going to deal with is our head gasket. It's too thick, which is hurting our squish gap, and it's too wide, which is leaving an empty void of space in between the head and the cylinder. The stock head gasket has a diameter of about 57mm, and the cylinder is 52, so you can see where that's not lining up. It's also leaking, so that's certainly not helping. To kill two birds with one stone, we're going to make our head gasket out of a soda can. This process is more involved than it sounds, so we'll go over that. But for now, it's going to help us decrease our squish gap significantly and allow us to trace a pattern to match bore diameter. Making your own soda can head gasket is pretty much as simple as it sounds, so we won't cover that too much. You cut out a can, lay the cylinder on top of it, trace out the bore diameter with an X-Acto knife, bore in a few holes for the studs, remove any burrs with a sanding wheel, and you're good. But there's a bit more to it than that. Because a soda can aluminum is already greatly compressed, it doesn't have many sealing properties on a stock head and cylinder. So we need to deck the head and cylinder to a mirror finish in order for this gasket to seal. Decking the head and cylinder is a relatively simple process, but it takes a bit of time if you don't have a lathe. Using the flat side of a glass table, I'll start with the head since we don't need to remove much material, and 320 grit wet sandpaper. I'll use water to prevent aluminum from building up on the sandpaper and creating high spots. If you get any high spots on your sanding process, you might have an uneven surface, which will not seal. I'll move on to 600, 1000, and 2000 grit sandpaper, and this will give us a mirror smooth finish on the head, which should seal up nicely to our soda can head gasket. Although polishing the head was only about 30 minutes, it's a different story for the cylinder. Not only do we need to remove about 1mm of material to get the desired squish gap, this has an iron sleeve, which means it's going to take significantly longer than it would on a standard cylinder. For this process, I start with a much more aggressive 60 grit sandpaper, and I move up in steps from there. Once I get close to my 1mm no-go line, I then start moving on to the polishing sandpaper, 320, 600, 1000, 2000. By the end of the process, which took about 2 hours, we had a mirror smooth finish on both the head and cylinder. When I move between paper, I like to use a Sharpie, and I'll squiggle some lines all around the cylinder head. This is so that if there's any deep spots from the previous sanding paper, I can find them and make sure that I remove all the ink before moving to the next paper. And I had been at this one for quite some time now, wondering why it wasn't working, and I assumed it was the iron sleeve. It turns out none of this is ink. All these little black spots is literally casting defects. It's just air pockets in the cylinder. Not too bad. I reckon she'll seal. We'll find out. It wasn't sealing in the first place, so I don't imagine we made it any worse. Now we're going to move on to some port work, and the factory really did a number on this cylinder. There's so many marks, especially inside the transfer ports, I don't know what they were doing. We're going to clean them up as best we can and try and remove all the lips from the iron sleeve. Removing the iron sleeve lips has a benefit. It increases airflow and reduces turbulence, but there's a catch. If the iron sleeve has better port timing than the cylinder itself, you might actually make things worse. For our exhaust and transfers, I'm not too worried about this because they're easy to fix and usually need to be increased anyways. But on the intake, removing the iron lip will cause the intake duration to be dramatically increased, and it might be a bit more than we desire with this motor. However, there's a failsafe. If the intake port duration becomes too much, we can window the piston and add a reed, or we can trench the cylinder and add a reed, something I've been experimenting with the Firestorm, and you'll see more on in future videos. Because the cylinder has an iron sleeve, I'll use my grinding stones a bit more than my carbide bits for the sleeve itself. This is just to help increase the life of my bits. But carbide bits will cut through the iron sleeve just fine, almost as fast as it would through standard aluminum. Although during this process my main goal was just to clean up the ports, I went ahead and widened the exhaust quite significantly and the intake just slightly. I couldn't go too wide with the intake because it would interfere with the ring-in gaps and cause a ring snag, so we focused mainly on the exhaust. Now I'll go ahead and put up on the screen what my stock port durations were and what we arrived at after removing the lips. You may have noticed while looking at our stock port timings, we had two listings for the transfer ports, and this is because of imperfections in the iron sleeve, causing one transfer to open 4 degrees before the other. This might not look or sound like much, but inside these motors where precision is everything, it makes a big difference, and I suspect it's where we're losing a lot of our performance. These ports opening at the same time are designed to help guide airflow towards the back of the cylinder next to the intake side and prevent it from going straight out the exhaust. And I could notice that while disassembling the motor, I saw a pattern on top of the cylinder showing fresh charge going straight from the transfers out the exhaust, which is bad for obvious reasons. I went ahead and matched these up so they would open at the same time. That took a lot of time and patience with my tools, but we got it done. It might affect the roof angle slightly, but I think having the transfers open at the same time would outweigh that disadvantage. There's a greater issue at play here, however, and that is the walls of the transfer ports. If you examine the stock cylinders on pretty much any motorized bike kit, you'll notice the walls are angled towards the intake to help guide the fresh transfer charge away from the exhaust, giving them some time to stay in the cylinder while the exhaust port closes. This cylinder, however, has straight walls that just carelessly dump the transfer charge into the cylinder, which I believe is what's causing most of the intake charge to leave before it can actually do anything to help us get performance. This, in my opinion, is why most stock motorized bike kits have decent low and mid-range performance without a pipe. They simply don't need the return pulse pushing that fresh charge back into the cylinder at low RPMs. It might not be optimal, but these angled walls definitely help quite a bit in improving low and mid-range performance. This cylinder, in my opinion, needs a pipe, and you'll find that later through the testing to be the case. I decided to try a technique which I've never used before. I'll leave a link in the description to the article which helped me out. I added JB welds to the corners of the transfer ports to help angle the charge towards the intake. I'm debatable on how effective this might be, so I'll let you know in the future if I have any further thoughts. This technique was relatively easy to do, but something that's probably going to be hard to master, and I'm pretty sure that I don't have it optimal. Getting just the right amount of JB weld into the port to create an angle towards the intake without adding too much to restrict airflow is something that's not as easy as it sounds. So to help complement this modification, we're also going to go ahead and add a pipe that'll help improve low and mid-range power, something this motor desperately needs because it has none of. We're going to go with the MZ65 clone that we've done previous testing on and had good results with. This has the longest header out of the 3 options I have available. I would love to try the real MZ on this motor, but because it has no bottom end right now and the MZ has a pretty short header, I don't think it's going to help us out too much in this situation. The MZ65 clone, however, has a pretty long header to help complement low and mid-range power. With these modifications out of the way, the bike's ready for a test ride, but before we get into that, I wanted to add a little bit of extra information that might be useful to some builders. I noticed during disassembly that this motor uses an identical wrist pin to the Phantom 85. It also has a 40mm stroke and a 52mm piston just like the Phantom. But it has a needle bearing, and it's $100 cheaper. Now obviously the quality of this kit is
really bad, so we can't do apples to apples here, but if this kit could afford to use a needle bearing, why didn't they put it in the Phantom 85? But that's on the side. More importantly is this opens up an option for modifications in the future. Now the Phantom 85 jug won't fit on this bottom end, the stud pattern's way too big, but we could possibly fit in some chainsaw pistons and play around with some advanced porting to really open up this kit. Interesting food for thought. Now on to the test ride. And it's going to be a bit of trial by fire because whatever results we get, good or bad, are what's going to take us to the gun range, simply because I ran out of time to do anything else to this bike, at least for this week. Only thing left to do is load up a few rounds of 45 ACP and hit the road.
If it doesn't run good, this is going to be a brutal trip because we're pretty weighed down in that bag. I don't have a support right here, but it's strapped to the rack right there, so it shouldn't shake around and break nothing off. That sounds promising. Whoa, hello. It never slipped the clutch before. Fix that real quick. Yeah, it's just slipping the clutch. That's a lot of low end power. The mid-range feels much better too. I doubt we have anything in the high range because I know it's running rich. This road is probably going to be absolute crap. It rained really hard yesterday. It's never a very good road when it's dry. I'm gonna need a better clutch on this thing now. Ah, sweet, nobody here. Hell yeah.
If you've seen our first video on this motor, you know this is a night and day difference in performance, as now the bike's actually practical and I can use it without pedaling everywhere. Before, it just couldn't be used. Any slight incline bogged the motor down so much that it would stall out if you didn't provide pedal assistance. The low and mid-range power increase are immense. The top end leaves something to be desired. However, this bike was never intended to go fast. Using 26-inch tires with the 44-2 sprocket and relaxed handlebars, I'm not too worried about top end right now. It does need some carburetor adjustments. The jet seems like it's too rich, and the transfer ports are a bit too low in duration for any more top speed. We only got about 27 miles an hour, which for this bike is just fine. What I really enjoy about it is its tractor capabilities. Low end power at low speeds. If you just barely touch the throttle and cruise around at 10 miles an hour, it just doesn't care. It doesn't jerk the bike around like a lot of motors would and bog down the motor. For now, this motor's going to need a new clutch. Claiming its performance is good because it can slip the clutch isn't really saying anything, as it's always had problems slipping while starting the motor. It could just never do it under its own power. I have something in mind for that, which might be interesting. In part 2, we'll be tuning the carburetor, and I might increase the transfer port duration just a little bit, so we can get a top speed of 30 miles an hour. That's all I got for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got some useful information. Until next time, ride safe.